G'day. Most motorcycle manufacturers start out producing small motorcycles and then eventually progress to producing larger capacity road bikes. We've all heard of the Honda CB750 and the Kawasaki Z1900, two bikes which put two iconic motorcycle companies on the map. There's no point me going into any detail on either of these two bikes, as they have been talked about by just about everyone 1,000 times over. So let's have a look at some other bikes which helped put other motorcycle brands on the map. Released in 1970, the road bike that actually put Yamaha on the map was their XS1, later to be known as the XS650 or TX650. It was Yamaha's very first four-stroke motorcycle, and while other model Yamahas would come and go, the 650 remained in production for well over a decade. It was more or less an improved version of the British twins, but its higher engine tolerances and its horizontally split crankcase meant it was much more oil tight and more reliable. More on that later. Compared to the larger capacity four-cylinder machines in the 1970s, the Yamaha 650 did fall short. Of course it did, it was smaller. But it was still a very well-built twin-cylinder motorcycle. The bike did have some flaws, like excessive vibration, which was pretty much typical of any parallel twin in those days. This excess vibration earned the bike the nickname the Dildo. The 650 also became known for its poor handling characteristics too. The first two model years were kickstart only, with an electric starter added for the 1972 model. In 1975, Yamaha addressed the handling issues with a new, stiffer frame on the 650B. While it was always overshadowed by Honda's 750 and Kawasaki's 900, its engine proved to be extremely strong and very reliable, and the motorcycle quickly established itself a very large and loyal following. In the late 70s, the styling changed to a factory custom version, with alloy wheels, raised handlebars and a stepped seat. The bike became known as the poor man's Harley, or the Japanese Triumph, because of the prejudice that was around in the 1970s towards Japanese bikes. This wasn't just because of the Second World War either, because many riders didn't want to believe that this so-called Jap crap, which was another term used, was better than their own bike. Another defamatory term commonly used during this era was rice burners. While it may not have been one of the best bikes ever made, it was an absolute classic, because it had character. It pounded the pavement hard while idling on the side stand. One of my 650s would occasionally backfire while starting and blow the rubber mounted carbies off, meaning I was left on the side of the road trying to push my carbies back in. Not an ideal look, I know, but back in those days I was young and stupid, and I didn't know how to tune a bike properly. Its engine was a simple single overhead camshaft 653cc air-cooled four-stroke parallel twin, which produced 53 horsepower. The bike covered the quarter mile just a tad under 14 seconds. But just to put that in perspective, that time is exactly the same time that a Ford Mustang muscle car of the same era did. Claimed top speed was 115 miles per hour, but I think that was just for riders with no fillings in their teeth, because once you got anywhere near the tonne, the bike vibrated, and it vibrated bad. The XS650 did nothing great, but it didn't break, it didn't cost a lot, it was just a very adaptable, rock-solid bike. It took Italian manufacturer Aprilia a little longer than most to start producing big road bikes. The company was founded immediately after the Second World War, but it wasn't until 1998 that they manufactured their first really large capacity bike, the RSV 1000, however you say it, which is the Italian word for 1000. It was a 998cc liquid-cooled 60-degree V-twin, which produced 128 horsepower. The engine was made by Austrian engineering company Rotax. Then in 2009, they created the ultimate adrenaline machine, the RSV4, which was a 999cc 65-degree V4 of their own design, and it produced 180 horsepower. Packed with heaps of electronic wizardry, this bike astonished the world with its state-of-the-art technology and performance. Styled with typical Italian flair, nobody could possibly make a superbike look sexier. Well, nobody except me anyway. The RSV4 cemented Aprilia's reputation as a manufacturer of high quality and high performance large capacity motorcycles. It was, and still is, one of the most impressive large capacity sports bikes on the road, and it is still in production to this day. Its now 1099cc engine produces 217 horsepower. It has a top speed of over 300 km per hour, and it covers a quarter mile in 10.4 seconds. While Triumph definitely made many fantastic motorcycles in their early years, when they introduced the first Bonneville in 1959, it was called the best motorcycle in the world. This original Triumph Bonneville was a 650cc parallel twin which produced 46 horsepower. Triumph claimed a top speed of 120 miles per hour, hence the model name, T120. It was a bit of exaggeration on their behalf, but it was still a fast bike. The first 3 years of production, the Bonnie featured a separate crankcase and gearbox. But for 1963, a new unit construction engine was introduced. They continued to improve this basic design up until the year 1970. Then in 1971, a new frame was introduced which held the engine oil inside it instead of having to use a separate oil tank. Then in 1973, the engine was enlarged to 750cc's and a front disc brake was added. But for the purposes of this doco, I'm just going to focus on the 650s, because from what I can gather, the best and most collectible model years of the Triumph Bonneville are 1967 through to the 1970 models. Performance specs gradually improved over the years, but a 1969 model, which is about as fast as they got, produced 48 horsepower and could reach a top speed of 118 miles per hour. Yes, seriously, they could go that fast in 1969. And with a quarter mile time of 14.25 seconds, the Bonnie was indeed quite a quick bike. Even though they had a reputation for leaking oil, I have often wondered how many riders back then bothered to regularly check the torque on the engine bolts. And apparently in some cases, the oil was just dripping from the crankcase breather, which is absolutely normal. So I'm not 100% sure they leaked oil as bad as what's been reported over the years. Maybe they were just neglected. Anyway, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one that thinks so, the Triumph Bonneville T120 is one of the most stunning and classically styled motorcycles ever built. It was the epitome of motorcycle excellence at the time, and it was probably the very first motorcycle, which could easily go over the magic ton, that was actually affordable for the average working class person to buy. Indeed, in the 1960s, the Bonneville was a bike to have. It was a real game changer. Prior to the mid-1970s, Suzuki focused on producing just two-strokes. They didn't start selling four-stroke motorcycles until 1976. 3 years later, in late 1979, they released the 1980 GSX 1100E, also known as a GS 1100E in some parts of the world. It was another super heavyweight bike which looked pretty much like any other Japanese four-cylinder, right? Wrong. It was the very first Japanese four-cylinder to produce 100 horsepower. But if you think it was the very first four-cylinder to make such power, you'd be wrong again. If you don't believe me, watch the doco Rare and Unusual Motorcycles, which is on the channel. It was also the very first production motorcycle with an alloy box section swing arm, and the first production motorcycle with fully adjustable front and rear suspension. The GSX engine also featured 4 valves per cylinder, At that time, only Honda was using this technology. But the GSX engine also had something else. It featured Suzuki's TSCC, twin swirl combustion chamber.
Each of the 4 valves is set in a machined part-spherical pocket to promote the formation of swirls in the incoming columns of air, setting up turbulence in the cylinders. TSCC improves on the 2 major factors which affect engine performance the most: intake charging efficiency and charge burning efficiency.
All this new technology is why the GSX 1100E is undoubtedly the bike that put Suzuki on the map. It made the GSX 1100E one of the fastest standard motorcycles in the world at the time. It would cover the quarter mile in a blistering 11.5 seconds, and top speed was 140 miles per hour. Within just a few short years, the GSX would be putting out 124 horsepower. The engine also produced a huge amount of low-down torque. The bike's styling had a squarish look that carried through to the headlight, the instrument panel, the tail section, and even the indicators. Although slow to begin the manufacture of 4-stroke motorcycles, the GSX engines went on to define Suzuki as a premium manufacturer of fast 4-stroke motorcycles during the 1980s and beyond. The GSX weighed in at 243 kilos dry, making it far from a nimble machine. But back then, for the Japanese, it was all about having the most horsepower, and decent handling didn't seem to matter. Thankfully, all that was about to change in 1984 with the introduction of this bike.
Say what?
The Kawasaki GPZ 900R, the first Ninja. This bike drew the line between a sports bike and the elephant-sized touring bikes. The bike took Kawasaki 6 years of development. Hence, it had many new features. Its steel frame used the engine as a stress member, and it had an alloy swing arm, improving handling and reducing weight. The bike featured adjustable anti-dive and air-assisted front forks, a single rear adjustable shock absorber. Its wind tunnel design full fairing offered good protection from the elements. It also dramatically increased top speed, and it certainly grabbed the attention of the buying public. The Japanese had finally mass-produced a bike which offered both high performance and decent handling. It was also a very comfortable, mile-eating touring motorcycle. Its dry weight, however, was still 228 kilos, as the lightweight revolution didn't occur until the following year, with Suzuki's groundbreaking GSX-R 750. The original Z1900 launched Kawasaki into the superbike era, but the Ninja 900 stole its thunder, because it too was the quickest and fastest production motorcycle of its day. The engine was also counterbalanced, which made it extremely smooth. It had a 6-speed gearbox, and it produced 115 horsepower. It could cover the quarter mile in under 11 seconds, and in one period road test, it was clocked on one run with an astonishing top speed of 154 miles per hour, making it the very first production motorcycle to exceed 150 miles per hour off the showroom floor. In 2024, the original Ninja will turn 40 years old, and although it may look somewhat dated and may not handle as well as a modern bike, in reality they are just as good to ride, and even today, just as fast as most new motorcycles. Like Ninja Warriors, the Kawasaki Ninja models are legendary, and they are still made to this very day. It is, without doubt, one of the best motorcycles ever created. Moto Guzzi is probably the most underrated of all motorcycle marques in the whole world. They have been manufacturing motorcycles since 1921. And back in the old days, before they retired from racing, where they had a huge amount of success by the way, they were in fact a very innovative company. Their signature 90-degree V-twin engine first appeared in 1967 in their 700cc V7. Then, 4 years later, they released this bike, the V7 Sport. It was the era of superbikes, and although faced with very stiff competition, this handmade bike did not disappoint. Its 748cc engine produced 70 horsepower, and while its shaft drive absorbed some of the power to the rear wheel, with a top speed of 125 miles per hour, it was every bit as good as the rest of them. But sub 14 second standing quarter mile times were often hampered by the bike's very tall first gear and somewhat grabby dry clutch. However, in the right hands, they are capable of getting into the low 13 second bracket. The La Franconi exhausts sounded amazing. The highly desirable and beautiful red frame version is a very rare beast indeed, and the suspension, the handling, as well as the brakes were all top notch. But typical of most European bikes of the era, the electrics were somewhat substandard. Overall though, the V7 Sport was an outstandingly good bike, but you needed a pretty deep wallet to purchase one. It was the single most important bike in the history of Moto Guzzi, and it changed the trajectory of this legendary Italian marque forever. The bike that secured the Italian marque Ducati's future was the 750 GT of the early 1970s. Although it never achieved the iconic status of other Ducatis and is rarely hailed as an iconic bike, it was, in fact, the bike that started Ducati on the road to success. Their brand new engine design had a very low centre of gravity. The lay-down front cylinder provided excellent cooling to the rear cylinder, and its narrow profile allowed for very spirited cornering. The tubular steel frame used the engine as a stressed member, helping to reduce weight and improve rigidity. The bike also featured extremely beefy 38mm front forks. Yes, 38mm was substantially larger than the norm in those days. The 750 GT was the first Ducati to feature their now familiar 90-degree L-twin motor. It was the beginning of a new era, and it would become the company's signature engine. Due to the super torquey nature of the engine and the bike's very low weight, in period road tests for top gear roll-ons up to 90 miles an hour, no other superbike of the era could get near the Ducati, not even a Kawasaki Z1900. During the glam rock era of the 70s, lurid metal flake colour schemes were all the rage, and the 750 GT was no exception. In terms of handling, stability and general overall performance, it pretty much outclassed every other motorcycle of the era. Reviews at the time said it was probably the best motorcycle that money could buy. That's assuming you could find one, of course, because they were pretty rare, and you don't mind having a few electrical problems, because like the V7 Sport mentioned previously, the electrics on the Ducati were not the best, but at least it didn't cost as much.